The studio lights blazed like a firing squad as Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the polished stage of the DC Policy Forum. One of those events packed with reporters, influencers, staffers, and political sharks pretending to be academics. The air crackled with the kind of nervous tension that only happens when two people who truly don't like each other are about to collide live on national television. At the center of the stage sat Jen Psaki, legs crossed, orange-red hair shining under the lights. Her expression carved into that trademark smirk she used at the White House briefing room whenever she was about to condescend to someone. She turned toward the audience, playing to them before the clash even started. "We are thrilled to welcome Karoline Leavitt," Jen said, dragging out the name as if introducing a teenager who snuck into the adults' table. Some in the audience chuckled. Karoline heard it, and she didn't flinch, not even slightly. She stepped up to her podium, crisp navy suit, hair tied back, posture sharp enough to cut through stone. Her presence alone shifted the room's energy. Even the moderator paused, sensing something dangerous under the surface. The opening question dropped like a stone. "Karoline, Jen says, your generation lacks seriousness in politics. How do you respond?" Jen smirked deeper, eyes sparkling with that "go ahead, prove me right" look that made half the internet adore her, and the other half despise her. Karoline inhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every camera in the building to lean closer. "Well," she began softly, "it's interesting to hear that from someone who spent years avoiding direct answers." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, but Karoline wasn't done. She turned her body just slightly toward Jen. Calm, controlled, surgical. "You can mock my age, my generation, my background," she said, voice steady. "But you know what you can't mock?" Jen raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Oh, do tell." Karoline didn't blink. "The fact that I don't need a binder full of prepared excuses to speak the truth." The room erupted instantly. Cheers, whistles, even gasps. Jen's smirk cracked, just barely, but enough for the cameras to catch it. Karoline pressed on, her words slicing through the noise like a blade. "You think experience is measured by how long you sit behind a podium. I measure it by how many people trust me to speak for them." And judging by the polls, she let the sentence hang. The audience roared louder. Jen shifted in her seat. Karoline had landed the first blow, clean, sharp, unforgettable, and the night was just beginning. The studio lights poured down on the panel like molten gold, heating the air, tightening the tension, turning every breath into part of the show. Jen Psaki straightened in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, confidence radiating off her like a shield. She thought she controlled the room. She always did. Smooth, polished, rehearsed. But across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, posture sharp, eyes steady, waiting. Jen leaned into the mic with that familiar, almost condescending smirk. "Well, Karoline, it's adorable that you think facts work that way," she said, her voice dripping with tea-brained sarcasm. The audience chuckled lightly, cautiously, but the laugh sounded thinner than usual. Karoline didn't react. No twitch, no smile, no frown. She watched Jen the way a fighter watches the moment before a punch. Calculating, patient, Psaki continued, gaining confidence. "You're young, you're new, you're enthusiastic, but politics, it's a little more complicated than reading talking points from your boss." Some people in the crowd nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Something about Jen's tone felt too sharp, too smug. Even the moderator glanced toward Karoline, curious how she'd fire back. Karoline finally leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the panel desk. "Jen," she said, her voice calm enough to silence the room. "You confuse being older with being wiser." The audience reacted instantly. Gasps, a few cheers, a few laughs. Jean blinked faster, caught off guard, the smirk slipping for the first time. Karoline continued, voice steady as steel. "You've spent years spinning stories for presidents who left Americans worse off, and now you sit here lecturing me. Someone who's actually talking to voters every day about what the country wants." Jen tried to interject, but Karoline cut through effortlessly. "You think I read talking points? No, I write them. And the reason my generation is stepping up is because the old guard, your guard, ignored the problems for too long." The crowd broke into applause, louder this time. Real, unexpected, rising like a wave. Cameras zoomed in on Jen's face, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing, the smile now thin and strained. Karoline wasn't finished. "You mock me for being young, but being young isn't a flaw. It's fuel, and America's tired of being lectured by people who think they're untouchable." The moderator nearly dropped his pen. Jen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the very first time, The balance of power at the table shifted. Karoline owned the moment, and Jen Psaki knew it. For several seconds after Karoline's last answer, the entire studio hung in a strange kind of silence, tight, electric, waiting. Even the panelists, usually eager to jump in and interrupt, stayed frozen. Jen Psaki narrowed her eyes, tapping her red pen against her stack of notes, clearly recalculating. She hadn't expected the 27-year-old press secretary to flip her opening jab this quickly. Finally, Jen leaned forward. "Karoline," she said with that trademark soft smirk she used whenever she thought she had the upper hand. "You're very good at sounding confident. I'll give you that. But confidence isn't the same as credibility. Your job, frankly, is to spin things. Mine was to tell the truth." The audience murmured, some nodding, some scoffing. Karoline didn't look offended. She didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, almost amused. Jen continued, sensing momentum. "You work for Trump. That alone makes half the country question anything you say. So tell us, why should Americans believe your version of reality over the facts they see every day?" Karoline smiled slowly, stepping toward her microphone like a fighter stepping back into center ring. "Jen," she began, voice calm, "you didn't tell the truth. You told a version of it that protected your boss." Jen stiffened. Karoline continued. "You built your entire brand by saying things that sounded polished and harmless. But Americans weren't looking for polished. They were looking for honesty." She took one step closer, her voice tightening like a pulled bowstring. "And you weren't honest." A ripple moved through the crowd. Jen tried to counter. "I was absolutely honest." But Karoline raised a hand, stopping her cold. "You told Americans the border was secure when it wasn't. You told them inflation was temporary when every family felt it crushing them. You told them Afghanistan was under control days before chaos erupted on TV. You didn't give the truth, Jen. You gave talking points. That landed like a hammer." A few audience members clapped. Others gasped. Jen blinked, thrown off rhythm. She attempted a laugh. "You're twisting things," but Karoline cut her off again, this time with the line that snapped the entire studio awake. "Facts don't change because you say them with a smile." "Jen," the room erupted. Cheers, whistles, hands slamming desks. People reacting like someone had just dropped the punchline of the year. Jen froze, her smirk faltering. Karoline leaned in, delivering the final twist. "You mocked me earlier. You tried to dismiss me, but the truth is simple. You had the microphone for years, and Americans stopped believing you. Now you're mad because someone else is holding it." The moderator glanced between them like he had just witnessed a political earthquake. Karoline stepped back, hands relaxed at her sides, owning the entire stage. Jen Psaki didn't speak. She couldn't because in that moment it was clear to everyone watching. Karoline had taken the room, and she wasn't giving it back. The moment Karoline finished her last line, the studio atmosphere shifted so sharply that even the producers behind the glass froze. Jen Psaki, trying to maintain her polished MSNBC perfect composure, leaned back in her chair with that familiar half-smile she used whenever she thought she held the moral high ground. But this time the smile looked thinner, almost brittle. She moved her papers, crossed a leg, and tried to strike back. "Karoline," she said, her tone coated in faux concern. "This is exactly the kind of oversimplified rhetoric that divides the country. You take every issue and flatten it into a cheap talking point. It's what happens when people with no policy background try to sound like experts." The liberal half of the audience clapped quickly, eagerly, hoping to shift the momentum back to their champion. But Karoline didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head with a steady, almost amused stillness. "Jen," she replied calmly, "you helped run the most chaotic administration in modern history. You briefed the press from behind a podium while pretending everything was under control. You don't get to lecture anyone on expertise." The room erupted, half gasps, half applause. Psaki blinked hard, surprised by the direct hit. "That's cute," she snapped. "But you have no idea what it means to handle real pressure." Karoline stepped forward, not raising her voice, but sharpening it. "Real pressure," she said. "You mean lying for Biden? Explaining away inflation, pretending the border wasn't a crisis, telling Americans the economy was strong while families couldn't afford eggs." "Yes, Jen, I'm familiar with the pressure you call leadership." The audience roared. This time louder, more unified. Saki's jaw tightened. She tried again. "You're twisting everything for drama," Jen insisted. "This country needs nuance, not teenagers playing politics on television." Karoline froze for a second, her expression going quiet. Deadly quiet. Everyone felt the temperature drop. Then she leaned into her mic. "I'm 27, she said, her voice low and precise. "And I've already done something you never could. I tell the truth without needing to spin it." The room exploded. Cheers, whistles, even chants. Pisaki's face flushed. The moderator shifted nervously. Karoline continued, her tone steady and devastating. "You call me dramatic, Jen, but the only people who think facts are drama are the ones who don't want to face them. You mocked the border crisis until it hurt your poll numbers. You mocked inflation until Americans couldn't fill their tanks. And now you mock me because it's easier than admitting your administration failed." The crowd jumped to its feet. Cameras zoomed in. Twitter would explode in minutes. Jen Psaki opened her mouth to fire back, but the moment had already slipped away from her. Karoline owned the room now, and everyone knew it. Jen Psaki expected Karoline to crumble. That was obvious from the way she smiled, tight, smug, the classic DC grin reserved for people who think they've already won the exchange. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and tilted her head like she was preparing to deliver a final blow. "So, let me get this straight," Jen said, voice dripping with condescension. "You're telling the American people that you, a 27-year-old press secretary, understand policy better than senior strategists, analysts, and cabinet members. Really?" The panel chuckled. A few audience members laughed along. Jen smirked, certain this would be the moment the crowd shifted back to her side. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply sat forward, resting her hands on the desk, her eyes sharp and steady. The room quieted instantly. Not because she spoke, but because everyone felt she was about to. "Jen," she began calmly, "age doesn't determine competence. Performance does. And based on what Americans have seen the last few years, I'd be careful bringing competence into this conversation." A wave of gasps rippled through the room. Jen blinked, caught off guard. That wasn't the line she expected. Karoline kept going, her voice gaining momentum with every word. "You mock me for being young. Fine, but here's the truth you don't want to admit. My generation inherited problems your generation created. High inflation, border chaos, unsafe cities, broken schools. And instead of fixing any of it, you mock the people trying to clean up the mess." The panel froze. The audience leaned forward. Jen tried to laugh it off. "Come on." But Karoline cut her off, her tone steady, lethal, unmistakably confident. "You asked if I understand policy better than senior strategists," she said. "Well, considering the condition this country is in, that bar isn't exactly high." The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause bursting through the studio like shock waves. Even the camera crew couldn't hold still. The moment was too explosive. Jen straightened, visibly rattled. Karoline didn't let up. "You want to talk about experience?" She continued. "Experience doesn't mean repeating the same failures for 20 years. Experience isn't worth much when the results speak for themselves." She leaned slightly closer, delivering the blow that would trend for the next 24 hours. "You tried to mock me, Jen, but the difference between us is simple. I answered to the American people. You answered to whatever political machine needs you that week." The studio exploded again, this time louder, sharper, almost shaking. Jen's face flushed red. Her smile vanished. Her confidence evaporated in seconds. And the panel. They sat frozen, knowing they had just witnessed the moment Jen Psaki lost control of her own show. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She simply leaned back in her chair, composed, unbothered, fully in command of the room she wasn't supposed to own. In that moment, everyone, viewers, panelists, even Jen herself, realized the truth. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just defending herself. She was rewriting the entire power dynamic of the panel, and Jen couldn't stop it. Jen Psaki leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with that familiar, "I've got this under control," smirk she perfected at the White House podium. The audience saw it, the panelists saw it, and so did Karoline. Maki tapped her pen lightly against her notepad, pretending to analyze, but clearly preparing her next attack. Karoline Psaki began in that polished, patronizing tone. "You keep repeating talking points that don't reflect reality. Facts matter. Data matters. Experience matters. And frankly, you're lacking all three." The liberal half of the audience laughed on cue, but it didn't feel organic. It sounded rehearsed, like a late-night show laugh track. Karoline didn't budge. Her expression stayed calm, almost amused, as if she'd been waiting for Psaki to walk directly into the trap. Karoline tilted her head. "Jen, you keep saying facts matter, but you haven't used a single one. Not one, so I'll help you. The laughter evaporated. Saki blinked. Karoline continued, voice steady, but edged like steel. You talk about experience, but your experience was standing at a podium telling Americans everything was fine when it wasn't. You told parents schools were safe when they weren't open. You told the country inflation was temporary. You told Americans the border was secure while cities drowned under the crisis. A stir raced across the audience. Even the neutral panelists leaned back, impressed. Pasaki forced a smile. Those issues are complex. Karoline cut her off with surgical precision. No, Jen. They're simple. You said things that weren't true, and when people questioned you, you spun it into political poetry. Pretty words, zero solutions. The crowd erupted. Applause, whistles, even a few shouts of exactly. Saki raised her hand, trying to regain control. Karoline, you don't understand the pressures of that job. Oh, I understand perfectly, Karoline replied, stepping forward. You use the press room like a shield. I use my platform like a window. Transparency, Jen. Something you never mastered. Saki's smile dropped entirely now. Karoline delivered the blow that froze the entire panel. You say I lack experience? Maybe, but I've never stood at a podium and lied to millions of Americans. That takes a very special kind of experience, and I'm proud I don't have it. The audience roared. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in on Pasaki's stunned expression. Pasaki opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline simply folded her hands, calm and collected, as the studio shook with applause. She wasn't just winning. She was rewriting the entire power dynamic of the panel. The panel tried to reset after the explosive exchange, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Viewers at home felt it. Even the producers behind the glass stared at their monitors, waiting for the next hit. Jen Pasaki adjusted, her microphone forcing a smile that looked more like a shield than confidence. Karoline, Jen began, her voice carrying that familiar DC condescension. You're very passionate, but passion doesn't replace experience, and it certainly doesn't excuse misinformation. The word misinformation triggered a wave of quiet groans across the audience. Karoline heard it. Jen definitely heard it. Karoline didn't rush. She let the silence stretch just enough for tension to tighten the air before stepping forward with calm, lethal precision. Jen, she said softly, whenever you're losing an argument, you hide behind that word. It's your safety blanket. The room ignited. Laughter, applause, even a few whistles. Jen blinked, caught off guard. Karoline continued, her tone unwavering. You lecture everyone about accuracy, but you spent years telling the country the border was secure, inflation was transitory, and the Afghanistan withdrawal was a success. So, forgive me if I don't take lessons on truth from you. The audience exploded again, louder this time, and Jen's smile snapped into something tight and brittle. She tried to recover. I'm not here to argue feelings. Exactly. Karoline cut in. Because feelings aren't your problem. Facts are. Another eruption. Jen's cheeks flushed. Karoline stepped closer, lowering her voice enough to make the entire room lean in. You tried to mock me. You tried to belittle me. But the one thing you forgot, she said, pointing gently toward the audience, is that these people aren't stupid. They see what's happening to their families, their cities, their economy. And no polished press conference can hide that. Jen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline delivered the final blow. You wanted a moment, Jen? She asked. Congratulations. You just gave it to me. The audience roared, standing, clapping, flooding the studio with noise so loud the moderators had to cut to commercial early. Jen stared ahead, stunned. And in that instant, the entire room knew Karoline had won. The moderator barely had time to reset before Karoline stepped forward again, the lights catching the edge of her blazer like she was walking into a championship round. Jen Psaki tried to keep her signature confident smirk, but the tremor in her eyes said it all. Karoline had taken the room, and she wasn't giving any of it back. Jen leaned into her mic. You know, Karoline, it's easy to come here with rehearsed talking points and act like you're the voice of the people. But the truth is, Karoline cut in, her tone steady and lethal. No, Jen. The truth is you don't like that someone younger than you, someone you can't control, someone who doesn't fold under pressure, can challenge your narrative. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, even whistles. Jen blinked twice, thrown off. Karoline didn't wait. You spent years spinning press briefings like they were theater. You talked in circles, avoided every real question, and treated the American public like they couldn't see through it. That's not communication. That's manipulation. Jen sat back, her smirk fading fast. "And now," Karoline continued, "you try to mock me because you think it'll work the way it works on your talk shows. This isn't your studio. This isn't your friendly audience. This is real America watching you crumble." A wave of applause rolled across the room. Jen tried interrupting. "Karoline, don't flatter yourself." But Karoline stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment hit harder. "I'm not flattering myself, Jen. I'm reminding you that the era where you controlled the message is over." The moderators froze. Jen froze. Even the cameras seemed to tighten their focus. Then Karoline delivered the final blow. "You tried to mock me tonight, but all you did was prove why people stopped trusting your version of truth." The audience stood loud, unified, electric. Jen stared ahead, her expression hollow, searching for a comeback that simply didn't exist. And in that moment, it was undeniable. Karoline hadn't just won the exchange. She'd owned the entire room. The studio had shifted, not slightly, not subtly, but fully, unmistakably. What had started as Jen Psaki's turf, with polished liberal commentators nodding along to every rehearsed jab she threw, was now slipping away from her like sand between her fingers, and everyone, especially Jen, felt it. She tried once more to regain control, leaning forward with that signature smirk, the one she used at the White House podium when she thought she had the moral high ground. "Karoline," she said, "your facts sound like something straight out of a campaign ad. Maybe take a break from social media and try reading a report once in a while." It should have landed. It didn't. The audience didn't laugh this time. They didn't clap. They didn't even shift. They waited because they knew Karoline wasn't going to let that slide. Karoline lifted her chin slowly, her expression tightening, not with anger, but with an almost surgical calm. "Jen," she replied, "if you want to talk about facts, let's talk about yours." A ripple spread across the studio. "You spent years behind the podium telling America the border was secure when everyone could see the footage proving it wasn't. You told parents schools were safe while crime skyrocketed around them. You told the whole country inflation was transitory and families still haven't recovered." Jen's smile vanished. And now Karoline continued stepping closer. "You want to lecture me about truth? You can't rewrite the last 3 years just because the cameras moved on." The audience burst into applause. Loud, unfiltered, electric. Jen tried to interject. "That's not," but Karoline wasn't finished. "You mocked me tonight. You tried to paint me as uninformed, inexperienced, emotional, and maybe that works on guests who are afraid of you. But I'm not." She paused, letting the silence sharpen every word. "I came here knowing exactly who you are, and America does too." Another wave of applause. Even the cameramen were struggling not to react. Karoline delivered the final blow with ice-cold precision. "You don't get to call me uninformed when your entire career has been about telling people what to think, not what's true." A shock rippled through the room. One of the panelists' mouths literally fell open. The moderator blinked rapidly, unsure whether to step in or let the moment explode. Jen sat back slowly, her expression shifting from confidence to something closer to realization. Karoline had not only countered her, she had exposed her live. And everyone watching inside the studio and across the country knew exactly who had won the night. The studio had erupted into a low roar, commentators whispering, staff rushing behind the cameras, the audience buzzing like a swarm of electricity. But Karoline stood perfectly still. Her posture didn't waver, her voice didn't tremble, and her eyes didn't shift from Jen Psaki for even a second. She looked like someone who had walked through storms before and learned not just to survive them, but to command them. Jen lifted her chin, trying to salvage dignity from the wreckage. "Look," she said, slipping back into her press secretary cadence. "This isn't about ego. This isn't personal. It's about facts. And the fact, Karoline interrupted, is that you tried to mock me because it was easier than answering me." The room snapped silent. Karoline took a single step toward the panel table, her heels echoing sharply across the stage. Every person in that room instinctively leaned forward. Jen's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something she rarely let show on camera. "Uncertainty. You call it analysis," Karoline continued. "You call it commentary, but what you did wasn't commentary. It was an attempt to embarrass a younger woman on national television because you didn't expect her to push back." Jen blinked, caught off guard. "And that," Karoline said softly but fiercely, "is why you lost this moment." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karoline didn't let up. "You wanted a sound bite to humiliate me, but you underestimated who you were talking to. You thought I'd shrink. You thought I'd stay quiet. You thought I'd let you frame me as inexperienced or overwhelmed. Her voice sharpened. You were wrong. The audience exploded. Cheers, claps, whistles. Even a few of the panelists sat back, eyes widened, stunned by the precision of the strike. Jen lifted a hand. Hold on. But Karoline wasn't done. You mocked me for being younger, she said. You mocked me for being confident. You mocked me for speaking clearly about what millions of Americans already feel. But guess what? That confidence isn't arrogance. It's conviction. Something Washington forgot a long time ago. A wave of applause crashed again. Jen looked stunned. Not angry this time, but genuinely unprepared. Karoline leaned closer, the studio lights catching the edge of her voice like a blade. You tried to mock me, she said, and all you did was prove why people stopped trusting the political class you defend. It was the single hardest hit of the night. The audience rose to their feet. Full standing ovation. The moderators exchanged looks, shocked by what had unfolded. The cameras zoomed in on Karoline, as if she had just delivered the moment the network would replay for days. Jen exhaled, lowering her gaze. She tried to offer a comeback, but the words weren't there. Not this time. Karoline capped the night with one final devastating blow. The line that would dominate every social feed within minutes. You came here to make me look small, she said. But you only made yourself look threatened. The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Some shouted her name. Some simply stared, stunned that a line so sharp could be delivered so calmly. Jen leaned back in her chair, silent. Karoline walked off the stage to thunderous applause. And in that moment, one thing was undeniable. She didn't just win the exchange. She rewrote the entire show.